The Federal Reserve Act Part 1. The end of the Civil War in 1865 ruined the Illuminati's chances to control our monetary system, as they did in most European countries. So, the Rothschild modified their plan for financial takeover. Instead of tearing down from the top, they were going to start at the bottom to disrupt the foundation of our monetary system. The instrument of this destruction was a young immigrant by the name of Jacob Schiff. The Schiff family traced their lineage back to the 14th century, and even claimed that King Solomon was an ancestor. Jacob Schiff was born in 1847, in Frankfurt, Germany. His father, Moses Schiff, a rabbi, was a successful stockbroker on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. In 1865, he came to America, and in 1867, formed his own brokerage firm with Henry Budge and Leo Lehman. After it failed, he went back to Germany, and became manager of the Deutsche Bank in Hamburg, where he met Moritz Warburg, 1838 to 1910, and Abraham Kuhn, who had retired after helping to establish the firm of Kuhn and Loeb in New York. Kuhn and Loeb were German Jews who had come to the United States in the late 1840s, and pooled their resources during the 1850s to start a store in Lafayette, Indiana, to serve settlers who were on their way to the West. They set up similar stores in Cincinnati and St. Louis. Later, they added pawnbroking and money lending to their business pursuits. In 1867, they established themselves as a well-known banking firm. In 1873, at the age of 26, Jacob Schiff, with the financial backing of the Rothschild, bought into the Kuhn and Loeb partnership in New York City. He became a full partner in 1875. He became a millionaire by financing railroads, developing a proficiency at railroad management that enabled him to enter into a partnership with Edward Henry Harriman to create the greatest single railroad fortune in the world. He married Solomon Loeb's oldest daughter, Teresa, and eventually bought out Kuhn's interest. For all intents and purposes, he was the sole owner of what was now known as Kuhn, Loeb, and Company. Senator Robert L. Owen of Oklahoma indicated that Kuhn, Loeb and Company was a representative of the Rothschild in the United States. Although John Pierpont Morgan, 1837 to 1913, the top American Rothschild representative, was the head of the American financial world, Schiff was rapidly becoming a major influence by distributing desirable European stock and bond issues during the Industrial Revolution. Besides Edward H. Harriman's railroad empire, he financed Standard Oil for John D. Rockefeller, 1839 to 1937, and Andrew Carnegie's, 1835 to 1919, steel empire. By the turn of the century, Schiff was firmly entrenched in the banking community, and ready to fulfill his role as the point man in the Illuminati's plan to control our economic system, weaken Christianity, create racial tension, and to recruit members to get them elected to Congress and appointed to various government agencies. In 1636, Miles, John, and James Morgan landed in Massachusetts, leaving their father, William, to carry on the family business of harness-making in England. Joseph Morgan, J. P. Morgan's grandfather, successful in real estate and business, supported the Bank of the United States. Junius Spencer Morgan, J. P. Morgan's father, was a partner in the Boston banking firm of J. M. Beebe, Morgan, & Co., and became a partner in London's George Peabody & Co., taking it over when Peabody died, becoming J. S. Morgan & Company. John Pierpont Morgan, or as he was better known, J. P. Morgan, was born on April 17, 1837. He became his father's representative in New York in 1860. In 1862, he had his own firm, known as J. Pierpont Morgan & Company. In 1863, he liquidated, and became a partner with Charles H. Dabney, who represented George Peabody & Co., and established a firm known as Dabney, Morgan & Company. He later teamed up with Anthony J. Drexel, son of the founder of the most influential banking house in Philadelphia, in a firm known as Drexel, Morgan & Company. Morgan also became a partner in Drexel & Company in Philadelphia. In 1869, Morgan and Drexel met with the Rothschild in London, and through the Northern Securities Corporation, began consolidating the Rothschild's power and influence in the United States. Morgan continued the partnership that began when his father acted as a joint agent for the Rothschild and the U.S. government. During the Civil War, J. P. Morgan had sold the Union Army defective carbine rifles, and it was this government money that helped build his Guarantee Trust Company of New York. In 1880, he began financing and reorganizing the railroads. After his father died in 1890, and Drexel died in 1893, the temporary National Economic Committee revealed that J. P. Morgan held only a 9.1% interest in his own firm. George Whitney owned 1.9%, and H. B. Davison held 1.2%. However, the Charles W. Steele estate held 36.6%, and Thomas W. Lamont, whose son, Corliss, was an active communist, had 34.2%. Researchers believe that the Illuminati controlled the company through these shares. In 1901, Morgan bought out Andrew Carnegie's vast steel operation for $500 million to merge the largest steel companies into one big company known as the United States Steel Corporation, in which, for a time, the Rockefellers were major stockholders. A speech by Senator Norris, which was printed in the Congressional Record of November 30, 1941, said, J. P. Morgan, with the assistance and cooperation of a few of the interlocking corporations which reach all over the United States in their influence, controls every railroad in the United States. They control practically every public utility, they control literally thousands of corporations, they control all of the large insurance companies. Mr. President, we are gradually reaching a time, if we have not already reached that point, when the business of the country is controlled by men who can be named on the fingers of one hand, because those men control the money of the nation, and that control is growing at a rapid rate. The House of Morgan grew larger in 1959, when the Guaranty Trust Company of New York merged with the J.P. Morgan & Co. To form the Morgan Guaranty Trust Company. They had 4 branch offices, and foreign offices in London, Paris, Brussels, Frankfurt, Rome, and Tokyo. The firm of Morgan, Stanley, and Company was also under their control. Paul Moritz Warburg, 1868–1932, and his brother Felix, 1871–1937, came to the United States from Frankfurt in 1902, buying into the partnership of Kuhn, Loeb and Company with the financial backing of the Rothschild. They had been trained at the family banking house, M. Warburg and Company, run by their father Moritz M. Warburg, 1838–1910, a Rothschild-allied bank in Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Amsterdam, which had been founded in 1798 by their great-grandfather. Paul, said to be worth over $2.5 million when he died, married Nina Loeb, the daughter of Solomon Loeb, the younger sister of Schiff's wife, while Felix, in March, 1895, married Frieda Schiff, the daughter of Jacob Schiff. Their brother Max, 1867–1946, a major financier of the Russian Revolution, who in his capacity as chief of intelligence in Germany's secret service, helped Lenin cross Germany into Russia in a sealed train, and later Hitler, ran the Hamburg Bank until 1938, when the Nazis took over. The Nazis, who didn't want the Jews running the banks, changed its name to Brinkmann, Wirtz and Company after World War II. A cousin, Erich Warburg, returned to head it, and in 1970, its name was changed to Warburg. Brinkmann, Wirtz and Company. Sigmund Warburg, Erich's brother, established the banking firm of S.G. Warburg and Company in London, and by 1956, had taken over the Seligman Brothers Bank. The Warburgs are another good example of how the Illuminati controls both sides of a war. While Paul Warburg's firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who had 5 representatives in the U.S. Treasury Department, was in charge of Liberty Loans, which helped finance World War I for the United States, his brother Max financed Germany. Through Warburg and Company. Paul and Felix Warburg were men with a mission, sent here by the Rothschild to lobby for the passing of a central banking law in Congress. Colonel Ely Garrison, the financial advisor to Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, wrote in his book Roosevelt, Wilson and the Federal Reserve Act, Mr. Paul Warburg is the man who got the Federal Reserve Act together after the Aldrich Plan aroused such nationwide resentment and opposition. The mastermind of both plans was Alfred Rothschild of London. Professor E.R.A. Seligman, head of the economics department of Columbia University, wrote in the preface of one of Warburg's essays on central banking, "The Federal Reserve Act is the work of Mr. Paul Warburg more than any other man in the country." In 1903, Paul Warburg gave Schiff a memo describing the application of the European central banking system to America's monetary system. Schiff, in turn, gave it to James Stillman, president of the National City Bank in New York City. Warburg had graduated from the University of Hamburg in 1886, and studied English central banking methods, while working in a London brokerage house. In 1891, he studied French banking methods, and from 1892–93, traveled the world to study central banking applications. The bottom line was that he was the foremost authority in the world on central banking. It is interesting to note that the fifth plank in the 1848 Communist Manifesto had to do with central banking. In 1906, Frank A. Vanderlip, of the National City Bank, convinced many of New York's banking establishment that they needed a banker-controlled central bank that could serve the nation's financial system. Up to that time, the House of Morgan had filled that role. Some of the people involved with Morgan were Walter Burns, Clinton Dawkins, Edward Grenfell, Willard Straight, Thomas Lamont, Dwight Morrow, Nelson Perkins, Russell Leffingwell, Elihu Root, John W. Davis, John Foster Dulles, S. Parker Gilbert, and Paul D. Cravath. The financial panics of 1873, 1884, 1893, 1907, and later 1920, were initiated by Morgan with the intent of pushing for a much stronger banking system. On January 6, 1907, the New York Times published an article by Warburg, called Defects and Needs of Our Banking System, after which he became the leading exponent of monetary reform. That same year, Jacob Schiff told the New York Chamber of Commerce that unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, this country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in history. When Morgan initiated the economic panic in 1907, by circulating rumors that the Knickerbocker Bank and Trust Company of America was going broke, there was a run on the banks, creating a financial crisis, which began to solidify support for a central banking system. During this panic, Warburg wrote an essay called A Plan for a Modified Central Bank, which called for a central bank, in which 50% would be owned by the government, and 50% by the nation's banks. In a speech at Columbia University, he quoted Abraham Lincoln, who said in an 1860 presidential campaign speech, "I believe in a United States bank." In 1908, Schiff laid out the final plans to seize the American monetary system. Colonel, an honorary title, Edward Mandell House, 1858 to 1938, the son of British financier Thomas W. House, a Rothschild agent who made his fortune by supplying the South with supplies from France and England during the Civil War, was Schiff's chief representative and courier, and Bernard Baruch, 1870 to 1965, whose stock market speculating made him a multimillionaire by the early 1900s, and whose foreign and domestic policy expertise led presidents from Wilson to Kennedy to seek his advice, were the two who were relied on heavily by Schiff to carry out his plans. Herbert Lehman was also a close aide to Schiff. President Woodrow Wilson wrote about House, published in the intimate papers of Colonel House, "Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. If I were in his place, I would do just as he suggested. If anyone thinks he is reflecting my opinion, by whatever action he takes, they are welcome to the conclusion." George Sylvester Viereck wrote in The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, when the Federal Reserve legislation at last assumed definite shape, House was the intermediary between the White House and the financiers. Schiff, who was known as the unseen guardian angel of the Federal Reserve Act, said that the U.S. Constitution was the product of 18th century minds, was outdated, and should be scrapped and rewritten. In 1908, Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and grandfather of Nelson and David Rockefeller, proposed a bill, in which banks, in an emergency situation, would issue currency backed by federal, state, and local government bonds, and railroad bonds, which would be equal to 75% of the cash value of the bonds. It was harshly criticized because it didn't provide a monetary system that would respond to the seasonal demand, and fluctuate with the volume of trade. Aldrich was the most powerful man in Congress, and the Illuminati's head man in the Senate. A member of Congress for 40 years, 36 of them in the Senate, he was chairman of the powerful Senate Finance Committee. In the House of Representatives, Rep. E. B. Vreeland of New York, proposed the Vreeland Bill. After making some compromises with Aldrich, and Speaker of the House Joseph Cannon, at a meeting in a hotel room at the Arlington House, his bill became known as the Vreeland Substitute. It called for the acceptance of asset currency, but only in cases of emergency, and the currency would be based on commercial paper rather than bonds. It passed in the House, 184-145, but when it got to the Senate, Aldrich moved against it, and pushed for further compromises. The Aldrich-Vreeland Bill, called the Emergency Currency Act, was passed on May 30, 1908, and led to the creation of the National Monetary Commission, which was made up of members of Congress. Now, any monetary legislation sent to Congress would have to go through this group first. The bill approved by the National Monetary Commission was known as the Aldrich Bill, and formed the legislative base for the Federal Reserve Act. It was introduced as an amendment to the Republican-sponsored Payne-Aldrich Tariff Bill, in order to have Republican support. It was based on Warburg's plan, except it would only have 15 districts. Half of the directors on the district level would be chosen by the banks, a third by the stockholders, and a sixth by the other directors. On the national board, 2 chosen by each district, 9 chosen by the stockholders, and 7 ex officio members to be the governor, chairman of the board, 2 deputy governors, secretary of the Treasury, secretary of Commerce and Labor, secretary of Agriculture, and comptroller of the currency. Most people were against the bill, because it finally identified the banking institution as a central bank, and the Democratic Party opposed it in the 1912 party platform. Aldrich was appointed as head of the National Monetary Commission, and from 1908-10, at a cost of $300,000, this 16-man committee traveled around Europe to study the central banking system. In 1910, Warburg gave a speech entitled, A United Reserve Bank of the United States, which called for a United Reserve Bank to be located in Washington, D.C., having the capital of $100 million. The country would be divided into 20 districts, and the system would be controlled by a board of directors, which would be chosen by the banking associations, the stockholders, and the government. Warburg said that the U.S. monetary system wasn't flexible, and it was unable to compensate for the rise and fall of business demand. As an example, he said that when wheat was harvested, and merchants didn't have the cash on hand to buy and store a large supply of grain, the farmers would sell the grain for whatever they could get. This would cause the price of wheat to greatly fluctuate, forcing the farmer to take a loss. Warburg called for the development of commercial paper money, to circulate as currency, which would be issued in standard denominations of uniform sizes. They would be declared by law to be legal tender for the payment of debts and taxes. President Theodore Roosevelt said, concerning the criticism of finding capable men to head the formation of a central bank, "Why not give Mr. Paul Warburg the job? He would be the financial boss, and I would be the political boss, and we could run the country together." After a conference was held at Columbia University on November 12, 1910, the National Monetary Commission published their plan in the December 1910 issue of their Journal of Political Economy in an article called Bank Notes and Lending Power. On November 22, 1910, Aldrich called a meeting of the banking establishment and members of the National Monetary Commission, which was proposed by Henry P. Davison, a partner of J.P. Morgan. Aldrich said that he intended to keep them isolated until they had developed a scientific currency for the United States. All those summoned to the secret meeting were members of the Illuminati. They met on a railroad platform in Hoboken, New Jersey, where they chartered a private railroad car owned by Aldrich to Georgia. They were taken by boat to Jekyll Island, off the coast of Brunswick, Georgia. Jekyll Island is in a group of 10 islands, including St. Simons, Tybee, Cumberland, Wassaw, Wolf, Blackbeard, Sapelo, Ossabaw, and Sea Islands. Jekyll Island was a hideaway resort of the rich, purchased in 1888 by J.P. Morgan, Henry Goodyear, Joseph Pulitzer, Edwin, and George Gould, Cyrus McCormick, William Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller's brother, William K. Vanderbilt, and George F. Baker, who founded Harvard Business School with a gift of $5 million, for $125,000 from Eugene Dubignon, whose family owned it for a century. Up until the time it was converted into a public resort, no uninvited foot ever stepped on its shores. It was said that when all 100 members of the Jekyll Island Hunting Club sat down for dinner at the clubhouse, it represented a sixth of the world's wealth. St. Simons Island, a short distance away, to the north, was also owned by Illuminati interests. Those attending the meeting at the private hunting lodge were said to be on a duck hunting expedition. They were sworn to secrecy, even addressing each other by code names or just by their first names. Details are very sketchy concerning who attended the meeting, but most scenarios agree that the following people were present: Senator Aldrich, Frank A. Vanderlip, Vice President of the Rockefeller-owned National City Bank, Henry P. Davison, of the J.P. Morgan & Co., Abraham Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, an assistant professor at Harvard, and special assistant to the National Monetary Commission during their European tour, Paul Moritz Warburg, of Kuhn, Loeb, and Co., Benjamin Strong, Vice President of Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, Eugene Meyer, a former partner of Bernard Baruch, and the son of a partner in the Rothschild-owned Lazard Frere, who was the head of the War Finances Corporation, and later gained control of the Washington Post, J. P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, Herbert Lehman, of Lehman Brothers, Bernard Baruch, appointed by President Wilson to be the chairman of the War Industries Board, which gave him control of all domestic contacts for Allied war materials, which enabled him to make $200 million for himself while working for the government. Joseph Seligman, a leading Jewish financier, who founded J&W Seligman & Co., who had helped to float bonds during the Civil War, and were known as world bankers, then later declined President Grant's offer to serve as the Secretary of Treasury, and Charles D. Norton, President of the First National Bank of New York. About 10 days later, they emerged with the groundwork for a central banking system, in the form of, not one, but two versions, to confuse the opposition. The final draft was written by Frank Vanderlip, from Warburg's notes, and was incorporated into Aldrich's bill, in the form of a completed Monetary Commission report, which Aldrich railroaded through Congress by avoiding the term central bank. No information was available on this meeting until 1933, when the book The Federal Reserve Act, Its Origins and Problems, by James L. Laughlin, appeared, and other information, which was supplied by B.C. Forbes, the editor of Forbes magazine. In 1935, Frank Vanderlip wrote in the Saturday Evening Post, "I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System." The banker initiated many depressions, the last of which had occurred in 1907, helped get congressional support for the bill, and on May 11, 1911, the National Citizens League for the Promotion of a Sound Banking System, an Illuminati-front organization, publicly announced their support for Aldrich's bill. However, the Aldrich bill was destined for failure, because he was so closely identified with J.P. Morgan. So, the Illuminati went to Plan B, which was the second version hammered out at the Jekyll Island Summit. The National Citizens League publicly withdrew their support of the Aldrich bill, and the move was on to disguise it, so that it could get through Congress. Once the new version was ready, they were a little apprehensive about introducing it in Congress, because even if it would be passed by Congress, President Taft would veto it, so they had to wait until they could get their own man elected. That man was Woodrow Wilson. The Democrats, with the exception of Grover Cleveland's election, had been out of power since 1869. Being a hungry party, the Illuminati found them easier to infiltrate. During the late 1800s, they began the process of changing the Democrats from conservative to liberal, and the Republicans, from liberal to conservative. Wilson graduated from Princeton University in 1879, studied law at the University of Virginia, and received his doctorate degree from Johns Hopkins in 1886. He taught political science and history at Bryn Mawr and Wesleyan, and in 1902, became president of Princeton. Because of his support of Aldrich's bill, when it was first announced, he was supported by the Illuminati in his successful bid as governor of New Jersey in 1910. The deal was made through Vanderlip agents, William Rockefeller and James Stillman, at Vanderlip's Westchester estate. The liaison between the Illuminati and Wilson would be his prospective son-in-law, William G. McAdoo. Rabbi Stephen Wise, a leading Jewish activist, told an audience at the YMCA in Trenton, New Jersey, "On Tuesday the president of Princeton University will be elected governor of your state. He will not complete his term of office as governor. In November, 1912, he will be elected president of the United States. In March, 1917, he will be inaugurated for the second time as president. He will be one of the greatest presidents in American history." Wise, who made this prophetic statement in 1910, later became a close advisor to Wilson. He had good reason to believe what he said, because the deal had already been struck. Wilson wasn't viewed as being pro-banking, and the Democratic Party platform opposed a central bank, which was now linked to the Republicans and the bankers. The main problem for the Democrats was the Republican voting edge, and their lack of money. After the Illuminati made the decision to support Wilson, money was no problem. Records showed that the biggest contributors to Wilson's campaign were Jacob Schiff, Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, Sr., Thomas Fortune Ryan, mining magnate, Samuel Untermeyer, Cleveland H. Dodge, of the National City Bank, Colonel George B. M. Harvey, an associate of J.P. Morgan, and editor of the Morgan-controlled Harper's Weekly, and president of the Harper & Brothers publishing firm, William Laffan, editor of the New York Sun, Adolph Oakes, publisher of the New York Times, and the financiers that own the New York Times, Charles R. Flint, General Sam Thomas, J. P. Morgan, and August Belmont. All of these men were Illuminati members. The problem of the voter registration edge was a bit more difficult, but that was a project that the Illuminati had already been working on. The Russian pogroms of 1881 and 1882, in which thousands of Russians were killed, and religious persecution and anti-Semitism in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria in the early 1890s, began 3 decades of immigration into the United States by thousands of Jews. By the turn of the century, 500,000 Jews had arrived to the port cities of New York, Baltimore, and Boston. It was the Democrats who initiated a program to get them registered to vote. Humanitarian committees were set up by Schiff and the Rothschild, such as the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, and the B'nai B'rith, so when the Jews arrived, they were made naturalized citizens, registered Democrat, then shuffled off to other large cities, such as Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Los Angeles, where they were given financial help to find a place to live, food, and clothing. This is how the Jews became a solid Democratic voting bloc, and it was these votes that would be needed to elect Wilson to the presidency. Second part is coming soon. In 1912, with President William Howard Taft running for re-election against Wilson, the Illuminati needed some insurance. They got it by urging another Republican, former President, Theodore Roosevelt, 1901-09 to run on the progressive ticket. Taft had served as Roosevelt's Secretary of War, 1905-09, and was chosen by Roosevelt to succeed him as president. Now, Roosevelt was running again. Advocating the new nationalism, Roosevelt said, "My hat is in the ring, the fight is on and I am stripped to the buff. Identified as anti-business because of his stand against corporations and trusts, his proposals for reorganizing the government were attacked by the Illuminati-controlled New York Times as super socialism. His Bull Moose platform said, "We are opposed to the so-called Aldrich currency bill because its provisions would place our currency and credit system in private hands, not subject to effective public control." Frank Munsey and George Perkins, of the J.P. Morgan and Company organized, ran, and financed Roosevelt's campaign. A recent example of the same plan that pulled votes away from Taft, in order to get Wilson elected, occurred in the 1992 presidential election. In a 1994 interview, Barbara Bush told ABC TV News correspondent Barbara Walters that the third-party candidacy of independent H. Ross Perot was the reason that Bill Clinton was able to defeat the re-election bid of President George Bush. The Illuminati was able to get the support of perennial Democratic presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, by letting him write the plank of the party platform which opposed the Aldrich Bill. Remember, the second version of the bill prepared at Jekyll Island was to be an alternative, so public attention was turned against the Aldrich Bill. Wilson, an aristocrat, having socialistic views, was in favor of an independent reserve system, because he didn't trust the common men which made up Congress. However, publicly, he promised to free the poor people of America from control by the rich, and to have a money system that wouldn't be under the control of Wall Street's international bankers. In fact, in the summer of 1912, when he accepted the nomination as the Democratic candidate for the presidency, he said, "A concentration of the control of credit may at any time become infinitely dangerous to free enterprise." According to the Federal Reserve's historical narrative, the shift in Wilson's point of view was a combination of political realities and his own lack of knowledge about banking and finance, and, after his election to the presidency, Wilson relied on others for more expert advice on the currency question. Because of the voting split in the Republican Party, not only was Woodrow Wilson able to win the presidency, but the Democrats gained control of both houses in Congress. Democrat, Wilson, 435 electoral votes, 6,286,214 popular votes. Progressive, Roosevelt, 88 electoral votes, 4,126,020 popular votes. Republican, Taft, 8 electoral votes, 3,483,922 popular votes. Representative Carter Glass of Virginia, chairman of the Banking and Currency Committee, met with Wilson after his election, along with H. Parker Willis, who was Dean of Political Science at George Washington University, of the National Citizens League, to prepare a bill, known as the Glass Bill, which began taking form in January 1913. Now Plan B was set into motion. Remember, the National Citizens League, headquartered in Chicago, had already announced their opposition to the Aldrich Bill. Now the Wall Street banking interests had come out against the Glass Bill, which was actually the Aldrich Bill in disguise. The Wall Street crowd was generally referred to as the money trust. However, a 1912 Wall Street Journal editorial said that the term money trust was just a reference to J.P. Morgan. The suspicion of the money trust peaked in 1912, during an investigation by a House banking subcommittee which revealed that 12 banks in New York, Boston, and Chicago had 746 interlocking directorships in 134 corporations. Representative Robert L. Henry of Texas said that for the past 5 years, the nation's financial resources had been concentrated in the city of New York, where they now dominate more than 75% of the moneyed interests of America. On December 13, 1911, George M.C.C. Reynolds, the president of the Continental and Commercial Bank of Chicago, said to a group of other bankers, "I believe the money power now lies in the hands of a dozen men." The threat from this powerful private banking system was to be ended with the establishment of a central bank. To avoid the mention of central banking, Wilson himself suggested that the regional banks be called Federal Reserve Banks, and proposed a special session of the 63rd Congress to be convened to vote on the Federal Reserve Act. On June 23, 1913, he addressed the Congress on the subject of the Federal Reserve, threatening to keep them in session until they passed it. Wilson got Bryan's support by making him Secretary of State, and in October 1913, Bryan said he would assist the president in securing the passage of the bill at the earliest possible moment. The Glass Bill, H.R. 7837, was introduced in the House of Representatives on June 26, 1913. The revision mentioned nothing about central banking, which was what the people feared. It was believed that Willis had written the bill, but it was later discovered that Professor James L. Laughlin, at the Political Science Department of Columbia University, had written it, taking special precaution not to clash with the Bryan plank of the Democratic Party platform. It was referred to the Banking and Currency Committee, reported back to the House on September 9, and passed on September 18. Senator Robert Latham Owen of Oklahoma, chairman of the Senate Banking and Finance Committee, along with 5 of his colleagues, drafted a bill which was more open-minded to the suggestions of the bankers. A bill drafted by Senator Gilbert M. Hitchcock, a Democrat from Nebraska, called for the elimination of the lawful money provision, and stipulated that note redemption must be made in gold. It also provided for public ownership of the regional reserve banks, which would be controlled by the government. In the Senate, the Glass Bill was referred to the Senate Banking Committee, and reported back to the Senate on November 22, 1913. The bill was now known as the Glass-Owen Bill. Senator Owen, who opposed the Aldrich Bill, made some additional revisions, in an attempt to keep them from completely dominating our monetary system. Senator Elihu Root of New York criticized some of these revisions, and some points were modified. It was passed by the Senate on December 19. Since different versions had been passed by both houses, a conference committee was established, which was stacked with 6 Democrats and only 2 Republicans, to ensure that certain portions of the original bill would remain intact. It was hastily prepared without any public hearings, and on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when many congressmen, and 3 particular senators, were away from Washington, the bill was sent to the House of Representatives, where it passed 298 to 60, and then sent to the Senate, where it passed with a vote of 43 to 25, with 27 absent or abstaining. An hour after the Senate vote, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, and the Illuminati had taken control of the American economy. The gold and silver in the nation's vaults were now owned by the Federal Reserve. Baron Alfred Charles Rothschild, 1842 to 1918, who masterminded the entire scheme, then made plans to further weaken our country's financial structure. Although Wilson and Representative Carter Glass were given the credit for getting the Federal Reserve Act through Congress, William Jennings Bryan played a major role in gaining support to pass it. Bryan later wrote, "That is the one thing in my public career that I regret my work to secure the enactment of the Federal Reserve Law." Rep. Glass would later write, "I had never thought the federal bank system would prove such a failure. The country is in a state of irretrievable bankruptcy." Eustace Mullins, in his book The Federal Reserve Conspiracy, wrote, "The money and credit resources of the United States were now in complete control of the bankers' alliance between J.P. Morgan's First National Bank and Kuhn and Loeb's National City Bank, whose principal loyalties were to the international banking interests, then quartered in London, and which moved to New York during the First World War." The Reserve Bank Organization Committee, controlled by Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, and Secretary of Agriculture David F. Houston, who along with Glass, later became Treasury Secretaries under Wilson, was given $100,000 to find locations for the regional reserve banks. With over 200 cities requesting this status, hearings were held in 18 cities, as they traveled the country in a special railroad car. On October 25, 1914, the formal establishment of the Federal Reserve System was announced, and it began operating in 1915. Colonel House, who Wilson called his alter ego, because he was his closest friend and most trusted advisor, anonymously wrote a novel in 1912 called Philip Drew, Administrator, which revealed the manner in which Wilson was controlled. House, who lobbied for the implementation of central banking, would now turn his attention towards a graduated income tax. Incidentally, a central bank, providing inflatable currency, and a graduated income tax, were 2 of the 10 points in the Communist Manifesto for socializing a country. It was House who handpicked the first Federal Reserve Board. He named Benjamin Strong as its first chairman. In 1914, Paul M. Warburg quit his $500,000 a year job at Kuhn, Loeb and Company to be on the board, later resigning in 1918, during World War I, because of his German connections. The Banking Act of 1935 amended the Federal Reserve Act, changing its name to the Federal Reserve System, and reorganizing it, in respect to the number of directors and length of term. Headed by a 7-member Board of Governors, appointed by the President, and confirmed by the Senate for a 14-year term, the board acts as an overseer to the nation's money supply and banking system. The Board of Governors, the President of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and 4 other Reserve Bank presidents, who serve on a rotating basis, make up the Federal Open Market Committee. This group decides whether or not to buy and sell government securities on the open market. The government buys and sells government securities, mostly through 21 Wall Street bond dealers, to create reserves to make the money needed to run the government. The committee also determines the supply of money available to the nation's banks and consumers. There are 12 Federal Reserve Banks, in 12 districts: Boston, MA, Cleveland, O, New York, NY, Philadelphia, PA, Richmond, VA, Atlanta, GA, Chicago, Eel, St. Louis, Mo, Minneapolis, MN, Kansas City, KS, San Francisco, CA, and Dallas, TX. The 12 regional banks were set up so that the people wouldn't think that the Federal Reserve was controlled from New York. Each of the banks has 9 men on the board of directors, 6 are elected by member banks, and 3 are appointed by the Board of Governors. They have 25 branch banks, and many member banks. All federal banks are members, and 4 out of every 10 commercial banks are members. In whole, the Federal Reserve System controls about 70% of the country's bank deposits. Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding, who was elected to the presidency in 1920, said in a 1921 congressional inquiry that the Reserve was a private banking monopoly. He said, "The Federal Reserve Bank is an institution owned by the stockholding member banks. The government has not a dollar's worth of stock in it." His term was cut short in 1923, when he mysteriously died, leading to rumors that he was poisoned. This claim was never substantiated, because his wife would not allow an autopsy. 3 years after the initiation of the Federal Reserve, Woodrow Wilson said, "The growth of the nation, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world, no longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the free vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." In 1919, John Maynard Keynes, later an advisor to Franklin D. Roosevelt, wrote in his book The Economic Consequences of Peace, "Lenin is to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. As the inflation proceeds and the real value of the currency fluctuates wildly from month to month, all permanent relations between debtors and creditors, which form the ultimate foundation of capitalism, become so utterly disordered as to be almost meaningless." Congressman Charles August Lindbergh, Sr., father of the historic aviator, said on the floor of the Congress, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized. This is the Aldrich Bill in disguise. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill." Lindbergh supposedly paid for his opposition to the Illuminati. When there appeared to be growing support for his son Charles to run for the presidency, his grandson was kidnapped, and apparently killed. Representative Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr. said of the bill, Congressional Record, June 10, 1932, "The bill as it stands, seems to me to open the way to vast expansion of the currency. I do not like to think that any law can be passed which will make it possible to submerge the gold standard in a flood of irredeemable paper currency." On December 15, 1931, Representative Louis T. McFadden, who for more than 10 years served as chairman of the Banking and Currency Committee in the House of Representatives, said, "The Federal Reserve Board and banks are the duly appointed agents of the foreign central banks of issue, and they are more concerned with their foreign customers than they are with the people of the United States. The only thing that is American about the Federal Reserve Board and banks is the money they use." On June 10, 1932, McFadden said in an address to the Congress, "We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. Some people think the Federal Reserve Banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers. The Federal Reserve Banks are the agents of the foreign central banks. In that dark crew of financial pirates, there are those who would cut a man's throat to get a dollar out of his pocket. Every effort has been made by the Federal Reserve Board to conceal its powers, but the truth is the Fed has usurped the government. It controls everything here, in Congress, and controls all our foreign relations. It makes and breaks governments at will. When the Fed was passed, the people of the United States did not perceive that a world system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers, and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure." On May 23, 1933, McFadden brought impeachment charges against the members of the Federal Reserve, whereas I charged them jointly and severally with having brought about a repudiation of the national currency of the United States in order that the gold value of said currency might be given to private interests. I charged them with having arbitrarily and unlawfully taken over $80 million from the United States government in the year 1928. I charged them with having arbitrarily and unlawfully raised and lowered the rates on money, increased and diminished the volume of currency in circulation for the benefit of private interests. I charged them with having brought about the decline of prices on the New York Stock Exchange. I charged them with having conspired to transfer to foreigners and international money lenders title to and control of the financial resources of the United States. I charged them with having published false and misleading propaganda intended to deceive the American people and to cause the United States to lose its independence. I charged them with the crime of having treasonably conspired and acted against the peace and security of the United States, and with having treasonably conspired to destroy the constitutional government of the United States. In 1933, Vice President John Garner, when referring to the international bankers, said, "You see, gentlemen, who owns the United States?" Senator Barry Goldwater wrote in his book With No Apologies, "Does it not seem strange to you that these men just happen to be CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, and just happen to be on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, that absolutely controls the money and interest rates of this great country, a privately owned organization, which has absolutely nothing to do with the United States of America. Plain and simple, the Federal Reserve is not part of the federal government. It is a privately held corporation owned by stockholders. That is why the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and all the others, is listed in the Dun & Bradstreet Reference Book of American Business, Northeast, Region 1, Manhattan/Bronx. According to Article I, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, only Congress has the right to issue money and regulate its value, so it is illegal for private interests to do so. Yet, it happened, and because of a provision in the Act, the Class A stockholders were to be kept a secret, and not to be revealed. R. F. McMaster, who published a newsletter called The Reaper, through his Swiss and Saudi Arabian contacts, was able to find out which banks held a controlling interest in the reserve: the Rothschild Banks of London and Berlin, Lazard Brothers Bank of Paris, Israel Moses Safe Bank of Italy, Warburg Bank of Hamburg and Amsterdam, Lehman Brothers Bank of New York, Kuhn, Loeb, and Company of New York, Chase Manhattan Bank of New York, and Goldman Sachs of New York. These interests control the reserve through about 300 stockholders. Because of the way the reserve was organized, whoever controls the Federal Reserve Bank of New York controls the system. About 90 of the 100 largest banks are in this district. Of the reportedly 203,053 shares of the New York Bank, Rockefeller's National City Bank had 30,000 shares, Morgan's First National Bank had 15,000 shares, Chase National, 6,000 shares, and the National Bank of Commerce, Morgan Guaranty Trust, 21,000 shares. A June 15, 1978 Senate report called Interlocking Directorates among the major U.S. corporations revealed that 5 New York banks had 470 interlocking directorates with 130 major U.S. corporations: Citicorp, 97, J.P. Morgan Company, 99, Chase Manhattan, 89, Manufacturers Hanover, 89, and Chemical Bank, 96. According to Eustace Mullins, these banks are major stockholders in the Fed. In his book World Order, he said that these 5 banks are controlled from London. Mullins said, besides its controlling interest in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Rothschild had developed important financial interests in other parts of the United States. The entire Rockefeller empire was financed by the Rothschild. A May 1976 report of the House Banking and Currency Committee indicated, the Rothschild banks are affiliated with Manufacturers Hanover of London, in which they hold 20%, and Manufacturers Hanover Trust of New York. The report also revealed that Rothschild Intercontinental Bank, Limited, which consisted of Rothschild banks in London, France, Belgium, New York, and Amsterdam, had 3 American subsidiaries: National City Bank of Cleveland, First City National Bank of Houston, and Seattle First National Bank. It is believed that the Rothschild hold 53% of the stock of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Each year, billions of dollars are earned by Class A stockholders from U.S. tax dollars which go to the Fed to pay interest on bank loans.